ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you all. Dear viewers, welcome to our Monday book club. And this is our third episode, as you know. And the book that we have been talking about is Centering the Black Narrative, which is a book about how blackness and whiteness is understood in early Islamic history, as we know that. And the reason that we started this book in our book club was that because the current situation with the racism and the struggle that started along with that, we wanted to educate ourselves that what should be the stance and how we should be thinking about these things. And this is where we are with this book now. So today, to understand the modern concept of race, especially in the West, because for the past few weeks that we have been talking about the book, we have been talking about the concept of race historically in Arabia and the neighboring regions of that, and how that was understood in that time. But since we live in the West, we should also understand what is the modern concept of race and how the Western world understands that. So to do that, we have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Tara Rowe. She is with us today. She is an assistant professor at University of North Texas, and she has a double master's in theology, and she holds a PhD in theology and philosophy. And she is an author of 2 books. One of them is already published, and the other one is about to come out. Dr. Tara, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the program. Let me add this too, Dr. Tara is a teacher and a mentor. I have learned so much from her. She's a gem and she never stops teaching. The knowledge keeps coming out of her and you keep learning and I have really learned a lot from her. Thank you so much. So on to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Aminah, and for inviting me to speak to you all today. I really appreciate that you have taken this on as a task. It's so important. It's so important as religious folk that we be reflective about our contexts and our faiths, and just really look forward to learning from you all and sharing my understanding.
And we're all very excited that you're here today. We made a flyer. The whole community knows you're here today. So we're very, very excited for you to be here today.
Great. Well, should I just get started?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to share some slides with you all. All right. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about race and religion. And again, I'm coming at this from the perspective of the West, but also I'm primarily a scholar of Christianity and Protestantism. And so that's certainly going to be reflected in my views. And so, like I said, really look forward to learning from you all as well. Your reading for today was so helpful, a really great overview. And just to summarize some of those key points that Mubarak and Wally were making is that they emphasized and demonstrated so clearly that race is not a natural or biological given. It's a social construct. It's something that has a history, and it's something that has developed historically. An example of that compared to geneticists. So geneticists say that among humans, we share 99.9% of our genetic material. And there are more differences between what we would think of as different races. There are more differences between those racial groups genetically than across them. So in other words, I share probably more genetic similarities with someone who I would think of as another race than I would someone else who is Anglo, with an Anglo background. And so, just to emphasize the point that that race is not something biologically rooted, but historically constructed. Um, and so, race, especially then, the way that the West views race has been especially constructed in modernity. And the way that we understand it today is especially influenced by Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who I will touch on in a bit. But I also want to emphasize that this modern concept of race has roots in or draws from early and pre-modern events, concepts, and key religious distinctions. And so, while we think of race as a very secular concept, it actually has very religious implications, very religious roots, which I think are important for especially religious folk to have an understanding of. So first, I'm going to, and this is a bit of an outline. I want to touch on how this modern concept of race is rooted in anti-Semitism. I especially want to focus on how early Christian self-definitions in their split from Judaism um, created some of these later concepts that Immanuel Kant will draw on. And Immanuel Kant also was drawing on these ancient roots of a myth of Anglo-Saxon purity. And then another theme that I want to touch on today is how modern racism not only is rooted in anti-Semitism, but also rooted in anti-Muslim sentiment. And we see this rooted in the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade and also in the conflict and competition between Christianity and Islam. So first, as I mentioned, Immanuel Kant. He was a German Enlightenment philosopher, and he was the first, scholars agree now, was the one who most fully and clearly articulated what we is now understood as the modern theory of race. Um, he distinguished different races, which he viewed as biologically inherited, and those races then there were moral implications for those distinctions, physical descriptions, implications for intelligence, and not only were distinctions made between races, but a hierarchy of value was attributed to them as well. So that's a key aspect of modern race from the perspective of the West that I want you to understand, is that it was most clearly articulated with Immanuel Kant, and that he articulated these racial differences, and not only were they differences, but those differences were hierarchically valued. And then a second thing that would like us to understand is that modern race then this understanding of modern race depends on a key divide between Orient and Occident, Oriental races and Occidental races, as they were understood, as they came to be constructed and understood. And so, where does this divide that modern race depends on come from? So scholars are arguing and pointing out that this divide between Oriental and Occidental really is a pre-modern, even ancient distinction. The concept of Oriental and Occidental peoples precedes Kant, and it's theorized to have roots in the split of Christianity from Judaism. So, as you know, Christianity started as a movement within Judaism. And then, as Christians were trying to define themselves as newly distinct from their Jewish roots, they began to articulate their difference from Jews, not as just based in religious difference, not just based in religious difference in belief, but in racial difference. So Jews were not just a different religion, they were a different race. So, and these early Christians started to identify Jews as Semites, as a particular race, and as Oriental, whereas Christians were Occidental. So that's one aspect that Kant in his modern theory of religion was drawing on, even though even from these ancient sources. Another ancient source that Immanuel Kant was drawing on is this myth of Anglo-Saxon purity. And this myth has its roots in a particular text written by Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. He wrote a text called Germania in 98 of the Common Era. And in this text, he describes what he calls the Germanic people. And these were peoples who had resisted the expansion of Rome. So that's why he had a particular interest in describing this group of people. There were a group of people who kept frustrating the attempts of Rome to keep expanding. And the ways that he portrayed this group of people had significant historical impacts, even into, as I will point out, into the United States of America. So he describes these Germanic people as pure, free from intermarriage, having blood purity, and an unmixed race. And then he highlights some strong moral qualities and admires their political organization. And then later, these Germanic people later come to be considered the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxon race. So this is where we get this concept of Anglo-Saxon race as something that is pure, something that is eventually superior. And then the English considered themselves descendants of these Germanic tribes. And this even carried forward to the American colonies, where Thomas Jefferson and many of the founding fathers relied on this account from Tacitus, and really fed into and were fully immersed in this myth of Anglo-Saxon purity. So Thomas Jefferson and many of the founders, like I said, they believed that America had been chosen by God to implement an Anglo-Saxon culture and a new form of government. They considered Americans to be God's new chosen, new Israelites who were taking the place of the Jews. So the Jews had kind of lost their chance, lost their place, and now this new race of not only Christians, but Anglo-Saxon Christians, and especially now American Anglo-Saxon Christians, are taking the place of Jews as God's chosen people in the world to put forward God's purposes in the world. And so as a result then of the ways that modern race was constructed on a distinction from devaluing Jewish identity, many theorists today increasingly recognize that anti-Blackness and racism has its roots in anti-Semitism. Now, another influence on Immanuel Kant's modern concept of race was the Atlantic slave trade. And this preceded Kant by a couple hundred years. But just a little bit of a background about the Atlantic slave trade and some of the things that made it distinct. So the Atlantic slave trade lasted for about 350 years. During that time, about 10 to 12 million Africans survived Middle Passage. So that means that even more Africans were taken from their homes in mostly West Africa, as you can see from this map. And many of them perished in the passage across the Atlantic. The reports that we have now are that 10 to 12 million survived that passage. In terms of a timeline, in about 1502, that was when the first shipment of African American slaves reached Hispaniola, and they were taking the place of enslaved natives who were dying at disastrous rates and from sickness and overwork. And the perception at the time was that the African race would be a stronger race to for the work that needed to be done in the colonization of the Americas. And one of the things, though, that makes so slavery had been going on for years. It was an ancient slavery was an ancient practice, but as I imagine you know, there was something distinct about the Atlantic slave trade, where earlier slave trades were people could be enslaved as a consequence of losing a war, and that meant that anyone could be a slave, anyone across ethnicities, across skin types, anyone could be enslaved. But now, with the Atlantic slave trade, we see a new alignment between someone's racial status and their an innate quality of enslavement. And so, with the Atlantic slave trade, we see slavery taking on a new racial status. Being African, having dark skin, became associated with slavery. And this slavery, this new transatlantic slavery, also has an important religious background. This transatlantic slavery, the colonization, and the racial concepts that developed as a justification for that enslavement emerged in the context of the Crusades, in the war of Christianity against Islam. And so, two key texts were written that where we can see that the enslavement and colonization were really initiated with two key texts, and these texts were Dum Diversas and Romus Pontifex, both written in 1452. They were papal bulls, which just means an official statement made by a pope, and they were issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Alfonso V of Portugal. And these two statements declared war against all non-Christians throughout the world, especially Muslim Turks, who are in the text identified as Saracens. And the specific language, I want to just share that language with you. So these two texts gave the king the right to, quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wherever so placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself, meaning the king, and his successors, the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them all to his use and profit. And so we have these two texts, and then another text about 40 or 50 years later, Inter Cetera, was the text issued to extend these rights from Portugal now to Spain. So this was after Christopher Columbus came back from the New World and said, hey, I've discovered this quote unquote New World, and Spain now would like these same rights applied to that were applied to Portugal. And so this another text, Inter Cetera, then extended those rights to this quote unquote New World, the Americas. And so at the same time, this transatlantic enslavement of people and the colonization was initiated by these texts. Then we also see correlating with this, these new concepts, these new distinctions of race emerging. And we see this especially with the biographer of Portuguese kings and princes during this age of discovery, Gomes de Azurza, who lived in the 15th century. He describes these slaves from Africa. He chronicled the arrival of enslaved West Africans to Portugal in the 15th century. he notes their different skin tones, even says some are lighter skin tones, some are darker, they have different language. So clearly there's ethnic differences going on here, there are cultural differences. But the key thing is here for him, all of those things, all of those differences don't matter. They are all of an African race. And because they are all of an African race, they all can be subdued into slavery. So even though this modern concept of race had not yet developed, we're seeing in Azura, we're seeing these distinctions starting to be developed between races, and then value assigned to them. So consequently, not only is modern racism then rooted in anti-Semitism, but it's also rooted in competition between Islam and Christianity. It's rooted in anti-Muslim sentiment as well, as it's identified in the Crusades, and then in the competition between an anxiety that was produced
Dr. Rowe, can you hear me? We cannot hear you. Reconnect. Uh, Dr. Rowe, can you please reconnect? Okay, dear viewers, as you guys can see that we are having a wonderful, educational session with Dr. Rowe, but, as technology always interrupts, so she got disconnected or maybe something problem with her internet account, and probably, all over the world, everybody is using all of these services. So I think that's what the matter is. But as you can see, the number of slides that we have watched so far, that this education, this knowledge is important for us, especially living in the West and especially working in Dawah. And how our Muslims should know the history of where this racism and slavery all came out from, because many of the slaves that were brought to US in the slave trade were Muslims. And according to one study by the Harvard University, it is said that 40% of these people were slaves. And dear viewers, the sad part is they were not only slaves, black people from Africa, they were from a civilization that was very much, established. They were from a very civilized part of the world, which we don't see it now in that way. But many of them were ulama and scholars. And if you study Africa in those times, what was Africa in those times, then you will understand that, the places that they were brought from in this manner, and how they survived over here. Unfortunately, we got disconnected, but Dr. Rowe had slides about early Muslims who came to US as slaves and what were they and how they contributed to that. And many times, if you study if Islam in Africa, you understand that the person who brought Islam to Africa for the first time were, yes, on the eastern side of Africa, it was the early Sahaba who went to Abyssinia to take refuge from the persecution of the Mecca. But it was Islam came as a force to Africa, force meaning in an organized manner, I would say, by the famous Sahabi Sayyidina Umar bin al-As, and he was the one who came to Egypt. And when he came to Egypt, Egypt was mostly inhabited by Coptic Christians. But the way, as always, Muslim army would come somewhere, they would not attack the cities. They would not interrupt the life of the people. Nothing of that sort will ever be done. But what they would do is they would create a masjid outside the town and they would stay there and they would take care of the government. But then the people were very accepting of the Muslims. You know why? Because they were very tolerant. And another thing, in those parts of the world and in those times, all the governments, all the ruling classes had the complete power to do whatever they wanted with the people. And many of these rulers, which were part of these places, they were very, you can say, they were very, very, they were not kind. They were evil. So she's back and we will go with her again. Dr. Rowe, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, Dr. Rowe, what happened was that somewhere in the middle we lost you.
Oh, no.
So, can you go back a little, because we were there when you were about to start about the Muslims coming to America and becoming enslaved, and you mentioned. So, if you can kindly please go back to those slides and describe a little bit, because we lost you in the middle.
Okay,
yes, so we are on the resources over here, but if you can go back a little bit, because we really wanted people to see those names, and if you can go back a little bit.
Let's see, right here, is that right?
I can't see the slide at this point, but if you can go back a little bit more. Share screen, if you're sharing your screen.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot I wasn't sharing my screen. I'll do that.
Yes. Okay. Yes, right there, where we saw that, yes, maybe start from here. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So there are some key implications of this history of religion and race for Muslims in America today. Many people think of the presence of Islam in America as a recent event, when in reality, Muslims have been a part of America since the very beginning. Already in the 1530s, we have reports of the first Muslims being brought to America from Africa as slaves. And in fact, scholars estimate that 10 to 15% of the 10 million slaves who were brought to America were Muslims. And most were prevented from practicing their religion here in the United States. However, historical records indicate that many African Muslim slaves strove to preserve their religious and cultural heritage even after some of them converted to Christianity later in life. We have historical documents, including oral histories of the great great grandchildren of slaves, as well as slave narratives and diaries, which I'll point out in a minute, indicating that some of the earliest Muslims in America performed salat daily. They observed the fast of Ramadan and recited and read the Quran. So some of the examples I'll highlight are Bilali Fula, Yaro Mahmud, and Omar ibn Said. So Bilali Fula first was a man who came from Guinea. He was taken as a slave as a teenager, and so before he was taken as a slave, he received a strong education in Islam. And during his time of while he was being educated, he was reading Islamic law. And the reason we know that is that we have what became known as the Ben Ali Diary, and this was a 13-page document. Who for several decades, scholars believed that was his diary, but it was written in Arabic, and so was not translated until 1931. When it was translated, scholars were shocked to find that it was not his diary, but it was a copy of a passage on Islamic law. So 13 pages that he had within his memory from his time as a youth, being educated in Islamic law. Those 13 pages were so deeply ingrained in him, so deeply rooted in him, that they survived the Middle Passage. They survived his life in slavery, and he was able to transcribe them down in this new land. And so this document now, which is held in the National Museum of American History, is the first Muslim document written in Arabic in the United States. It's considered the mother text of American Islamic literature. Another example is Yaro Mahmud, who became freed in 1807 in Washington, D.C. And he became quite a successful businessman after that. He established a hauling business, he owned real estate, and even became an early shareholder in the Columbia Bank, which was the second chartered bank in the United States. He lived to be over 100, and he was such a remarkable figure, someone who practiced his faith throughout his life, that he grabbed the attention of the famous painter Charles William Peale, who painted his portrait in 1819. And so this is the oldest portrait that we have of a Muslim American in the United States. And then the final example is Omar ibn Said, who also, like Bilali Fula, was from West Africa, also received a strong education in Islamic law before he was enslaved. In fact, he studied Islam for 25 years before he was enslaved. During that time, before his enslavement, he performed Hajj, and then he was brought to America as a slave. Sold in Charleston. He escaped and was imprisoned, was considered a madman because he spoke a language that no one could understand. He was later purchased by Governor John Owen, and then went on to write his autobiography in 1831. And his autobiography is important because it's the first autobiography that was written by an enslaved Muslim from his own perspective. So we have other biographies of enslaved people, but they were often transcribed through their owners, through their slave owners. And so, of course, then there was probably editing and things like this. But with Omar ibn Said's autobiography, these are his words coming from himself about his life, and his faith as a Muslim, and then later he converted to Christianity. But it sounds like even in his late life, he still retained a strong connection to Islam. So from these examples and this history of the modern Western concept of race, something that a kind of a key point that I would really like to emphasize and to convey to you all is the following: that race and racism is an intensely religious issue. And this is not only for the justice concerns that many of us as people of faith have, but also because because religious divisions, distinctions, concepts, and conflicts have also intimately informed the modern concept, the modern construct of race, and the practice of racism today. And so, and here are a list of recommended resources that I have used, that I have referenced and relied on in constructing this presentations. All wonderful resources, and I'm happy to share this list to have this distributed. So I think that's everything that I have, and I will bring it back to the main screen then.
So can you see me now on the screen?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. This was wonderful. We really, really learned a lot. So, Dr. Rowe, there are certain questions. I have taken them out from here. So, one question is that before Islam, Christianity was all over the world, even when, European colonization took place and all of that. So, as we know that even when Muslims from Arabia went to Africa, the Africa had Coptic Christians over there, and all of that. But those were the people of color. Those were not white people. But when the colonizers came, then they could not see the similarity of religion over there. And I'm sure in Africa, the Christianity was there long before Islam. So when these people, European colonizers came there and they were having these debates about, these people of color, what are they, who are they, do they have souls or not? But then later on, many people entered Christianity with that too, right? So how do we, wrap this up? People are just, there is a comment that, but Christianity was already in Africa long before Islam and other parts of the world. So what about this religious, they were already Christians, then why they were not able to accept people of color in that manner?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and a really troubling one, right? Because you're exactly right. And not only were there Christians who were African, but some of the most important Christians in terms of shaping later doctrine and theology were Africans. I mean, you probably understand. Some of your listeners probably know the concept of the Christian concept of the Trinity. That word itself is African. It came from Tertullian, who was an African Christian. And
imagine that. Imagine that. Who would have thought that Trinity is an African word?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep. And Saint Augustine, who it's hard to overestimate his impact on Western Christianity, on Protestantism. He was West African, and so yes, there's this. There's this profound disconnect within Christianity today and in modernity, and we see this frankly, a whitewashing of Christianity that develops in modernity after slavery. So slavery was an institution that had to be justified, and in order to justify that slavery, Christianity needed to be whitewashed. And so then we see the whitewashing. We still know about Augustine and Tertullian, but in fact, most of the images still today that we have of those figures are white skinned.
Are white, and in the current crisis, this is one of the point that came up, that why is Jesus and all these figures are whitewashed when they were not. Yes. So probably can we deduce from that, Dr. Rowe, that religion has always been used for something it does not stand for, right?
Sorry, that I had a little glitch. Can you repeat that one more
Yes,
time?
for like there is another comment over here, and they're saying that religion, because other religions have a similar history. When a religion is used for something to justify something that religion does not stand for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's something that as people of faith that we need to wrestle with. That something that can be so beloved and so meaningful can be used in powerful ways, destructive, just evil ways. And so I don't want to make a blanket statement say that any religion has or can be, but I know for a fact in studying Christianity that Christianity has, while many still find that profoundly meaningful, it has been used in profoundly destructive ways, and I think it's a vulnerability of a human, of something that may be divine, but it passes through human bodies and human constructs and can be embodied in powerful and destructive ways.
Yes. So, but one more comment. Then there is another comment that somebody's asking. So, what do you suggest? Because they say that you have really brought it to the conclusion that this is a religious, problem. This problem is embedded in religion, because many times with the rise of social sciences, we tend to think that it was then science who took over, and social Darwinism came in, and religion lost its power to justify. But still, as we know now, that people are coming back to religion once again, especially in the present crisis too. So somebody's asking that, one of the comments over here is, what should we do in order to have this interreligious debate, or you can interreligious dialogue, to understand this more, especially from the religious perspective?
Yeah, I think that one of the more dangerous aspects of the theory of secularization, which also is a modern Western concept and has been used also for colonization, is that it not only diminishes the positive aspects of religion, but it also allows us to overlook the negative ways that religion has been used as well. So, for
Exactly.
example, Thomas Jefferson, he was, he was a deist, and so had religious beliefs, but people often paint him as secular. However, what is missed, that Kelly Brown Douglas, who I mentioned in the list of resources, emphasizes, that I think is such a profound point, is that he was able to be kind of trans-religious and more secular because his deepest religion was actually Anglo-Saxonism. That was his deepest kind of religious impetus. And so if we ignore the if we take the route of pure secularism and ignore the positive aspects of religion, we're also going to overlook those very negative aspects of religion that still are infusing and informing the ways that that folks are making decision and informing, frankly, American policy still today.
Yes, exactly. Dr. Rowe, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. The slides were wonderful. All of us really learned a lot today. Thank you for your time, and we will keep inviting you back. I think the next topic will be Islam and environment. Dr. Rowe and I just finished a study on that. It was wonderful with her. We went to for a month-long study, and she really enlightened me on that too. So I think that should be the next talk we should have.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Amina, you were the teacher for that one. So yeah, I would love to come back anytime. Thank you so much for having this conversation, for inviting me, and yeah, look forward to learning from you all as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Rowe. Thanks a lot. The book club, I hope and I pray that you benefited from that. This is a knowledge. I would like all of you to even share this with your children, because growing up Muslims, growing up American Muslims, this is their history. This is something that they should know as part of their history as American Muslims. And as Dr. Rowe has already said, the pioneers of America, we are not taught about them the way they were. Like Thomas Jefferson, our kids go through the history books and learn about him, but they don't learn about him the way that we just talked about it. So I think this is very, very important. If you please can take the time to share this presentation with your children, because do understand this is their history and this will empower them. With that, we come to the conclusion. Jazakumullah khairan katira, and we will see you guys next week. Assalamu alaikum.
قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون والذين هم للزكاة فاعلون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين.